Let me start with a small prayer. Sadashiva-Samarambham Shankaracharya-Madhyamam Asmadacharya-Paryantam Vande Guru-Paramparam Bharati Karunapatram Bharati Padabhushanam Bharati Padamarudam Bharati Tirthamashraye Vidya-Vinaya-Sampannam Vitaragam Vivekinam Vande Vedanta-Tattvagyam Vidushekhara-Bharatim ईश्वरो गुरुरात्मेति मूर्तिभेदविभागिने व्योमवद्व्याप्तदेहाय श्रीदक्षिणामूर्तये नमः. So today the topic is the Purushartha worldview and the aspects of Kama, and Raghavji requested me to thank Raghavji for inviting me here for this session. So it so happened that Purushartha as a framework has been have been interested in this framework for last 10 plus years since I came across this concept in a proper way. And but most of us are who are aware of this framework, and I'm presuming that those in the audience are aware of the general framework of Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. We are aware of the conventional model of Purushartha and the conventional understanding of Kama. So it so happened that I stumbled upon certain interesting insights from Kama Sutra, Vatsayana's Kama Sutra, and Mahabharata, and that led me to do a detailed research into Kama as a Purushartha itself. So I'm just sharing a few interesting insights which I found out as part of my research. So basically, Purushartha is one of the most fundamental frameworks that Hindu philosophy, our rishis have given us to evaluate life, to understand life, to negotiate life. As the term stands for, Purusha means a person, an individual, and Artha means meaning. It is something. It refers to all those actions which gives one or the other kind of meaning to life, or we can say it as a purpose of life, or Purushartha. Artha here can be opposite of Anartha. Anartha has a sense of calamity, and Artha it will be opposite of that, right? Uh, in many of the texts, I have just quoted one or two here, but in many across the different genres of Hindu literature, we see that there is in the conventional model of Purushartha, there is an enunciation which notes that uh, it speaks about Chaturvida Purushartha, the fourfold Purusharthas, but it also speaks about Trivarga. The Dharma, Artha, and Kama is combined together as a threefold form of Trivarga, and there is Moksha posited separately as Apavarga, separate from that. But what we see is that there is a kind of a hierarchy in the conventional sense that Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. The Dharma comes first, Moksha comes last. Moksha is last because it is the ultimate goal of life. Dharma comes first because it's the primary goal of life. Through dharma, the artha and kama has to be pursued. Only then it will be meaningful pursuit. Otherwise, it will lead to a lot of recklessness. So this is the conventional understanding. Dharma refers to uh, aligning our actions in an ethical way, and in a sense of duty, as enunciated in the shastras. So that the ethics and the duties are anchored in the shastras. The artha is pursuit of material prosperity. Kama, in a general sense, in a conventional sense, is pursuit of mundane pleasures. So this hierarchy is present. So dharma is the primary purushartha, artha and kama secondary purusharthas, auxiliary to dharma, and moksha is the ultimate purushartha. But point to note here is kama is defined as in a worldly sensory desire, and sometimes this worldly sensory desire is considered as an impediment to the ultimate goal of moksha. That is why we say vairagya is needed to pursue moksha. And kama is also considered as part of the Arishad Varga, the six passions, which are impurities of the mind, uh, which are lobha, kama, and matsarya, mada, etc. But what is interesting is that in Mahabharata, there is a discussion between Vidura and the five Pandavas, wherein Bhima provides a very more deeper enunciation of kama, much more than what is conventionally understood. And we find that uh, there is a very nuanced twofold definition of kama available in texts such as Vatsayana's Kama Sutra. And let me start with a brief definition of kama. Please let me know if the time, if 20 minutes is getting over.
I will, Nitinji will follow you out on.
Yeah, yeah. So the Sanskrit word kama can be translated into English as desire, love, affection, object of desire, pleasure, enjoyment, etc. So technically speaking, the Kama Sutra provides two separate definitions in two verses. In the first chapter itself, it provides two different definitions. In the first definition, I have not included the Sanskrit verse here. It basically, in the first definition, it defines kama as pravritti. Uh, Kama as pravritti of the senses, of the senses of ear, skin, eye, that is the pancha indriyas. It's a pravritti of the pancha indriyas whose base is in the manas, anchored to Atman. It is the pravritti of such a senses, mind senses complex towards those objects to which they are naturally drawn to. So the key phrase here is pravritti, that is inclination, flow, which we can say in a sense it refers to desire. Desire could be about any object, any action, any person that is perceived by the mind and the senses as a source of pleasure. So desire for some object is kama. It in the second definition, in the very next verse, it says it defines kama as pratiti, or the direct awareness or experience of what results from the contact of the abhimanika sukhana vidya. That's what it says. The one who self-identifies and who experiences joy. That is the mind with the objects of senses. So basically, it is says first it says kama as pravritti or desire for an object, and then it says kama as pratiti or the direct experience or the enjoyment or the pleasure that is experienced on the attainment of that object. So in this way, it the Kama Sutra provides a dual definition of kama as pravritti or desire and pratiti or pleasure. That is as the means as well as the goal, as well as the end goal. So when I came across this desire, I found it very interesting. I found it something which I at least I was not aware of. A few years ago, I came across this, and I was not aware before that. Generally we take kama as a sexual desire, at best a desire of to mundane objects, mundane pleasures, and but this definition was completely taken me aback. And I had put a WhatsApp status. I think it is still there. There is raga even in Vairaga, Viraga. So this is a perspective which actually this sentence is a perspective that I'll be just explaining to you over the next few slides, basically. So in my research, I found that in the conventional model, dharma is the primary purushartha, moksha is the parama purushartha, ultimate purushartha. But in a very deeper sense, without contradicting the contemporary model, and that is the important. The model I'm proposing does not contradict it. It does not rebut or reject the conventional model. It merely provides a different way to look at it. And in this model, you can see that in a true deeper sense, it is actually kama itself which is the primary purushartha, and kama itself it is the ultimate or parama purushartha, and in fact, kama itself is the true Purushartha. The real Purushartha is Kama. How it is so? As I said, Kama has twofold definition. One as a desire, which is the means to attain an object, because it is desire which impels one to pursue anything. So, if you take up this larger meaning of Kama in a universal sense, the desire for anything, then all desires are Kama, including the desire for, say, karmic merit, that is, desire for punyam, desire for wealth, desire for mundane and erotic pleasures, of course. So, what does it mean? It is this desire which impels us to pursue dharma, artha, kama. Not just that. The Trivargas constituted three different forms or special manifestation of kama. Without the principle of desire, neither dharma nor artha is possible, as desire impels action required to acquire dharma and artha. Therefore, kama is the cause of dharma and artha. And dharma, artha, kama, all the three in the conventional model can be understood as special manifestations of desire itself. Because ultimately, what is dharma other than being a desire for karmic merit, the desire for attaining punyam? What is artha other than the desire to attain material prosperity or wealth, Lakshmi? What is kama of the conventional model other than attaining desire for pleasure, the mundane pleasure, including sexual pleasure? And interestingly, the same can be argued for the case of mumukshutvam. In the case of moksha, the Upanishad and the Vedantic Darshana, the Vedanta Darshana says, the Shankaracharya says, to attain moksha through Atma Jnanam, first you have to have fourfold qualities called sadhana chatushtayam. And one of the most important part of the sadhana chatushtayam is mumukshutva. Mumukshutva by definition means burning desire for liberation. One who has such a burning desire means a desire excluding all other desires. So Vairagya means dispassion towards worldly desire and having only one desire, that is for liberation. So Mumukshutvam is again, ultimately it's a desire, whether though it is not a desire for mundane objects, it is a desire for Brahman. But so it is desire also, right? So Mumukshutvam is also a special manifestation of Kama itself and a root cause for liberation, not an immediate cause, because it is Atma Jnana that grants moksha. But it's the root cause, because of Mumukshutvam only we then put in effort to gain sadhana, the rest of the sadhana chatushtaya, and then practice Shravana Manana Nidhyasana to gain moksha. So in this way, the details of this are available in my paper, which is published in Indic Today magazine. I have just summarized the findings in a sense. And much of these arguments are based on Bhima's argument in Mahabharata. So kama in its aspect of pravritti or the desire is primary purushartha. And the reason it is primary purushartha is because it is the cause of pursuit of dharma, artha, kama. And it is also dharma, artha, kama in the conventional model can be seen as a special manifestation or a distinct form of this kama itself. So there are two aspects. That is why it is primary purushartha, because it is kama which impels us to take up a pursuit of dharma, artha, kama in the conventional model. Now, the second aspect, I said that there is a dual definition, kama as pravritti, kama as pratiti. So the pratiti aspect, the pleasure aspect, even here, you can see, let us consider what is the result, end goal of pursuing artha. And here I have taken Bhojaraja's Shringara Prakasha. He mentions these aspects and he mentions it beautifully. He says a pursuit of artha leads to pleasure in the form of reinforcement of self-identity. It's in the form of a sense of social worth. That is, he says this pursuit, those who have this kind of mental setup and who pursue artha in isolation, they do so, they are not, they accumulate wealth, they accumulate objects, not to enjoy them, but to have a sense of social security and social worth. And similarly, a pursuit of karma, that is in a conventional limited sense, leads to pleasure in the form of sensory enjoyment. That is, we buy something, I like a ice cream, I buy ice cream, I eat ice cream, I enjoy that ice cream for that moment it lasts. This is the pursuit of karma in a normal sense. And a pursuit of dharma, it also leads to a kind of a pleasure in the form of satisfaction and contentment in the fact that the person is pursuing artha and kama with staying within the ethical framework, staying within the precepts of the shastras. So there is only a difference in the form of pleasure being experienced when you pursue artha, when you pursue kama, when you pursue dharma in the normal sense. But all of them are pleasure only. There is a experience of pleasure, be it in the form of conviction that I have gained punyam in the case of dharma, or be it in the form of pleasure, conviction, or the happiness in the form of sense of social worth, reinforcement of one's self perception, or it is in the form of enjoyment of mundane pleasures. So the pursuit of Trivarga ends with pleasure. The difference is only in the form of pleasure one experience. Therefore, we can say that kama, in the sense of pleasure, is the true end goal of the Trivarga. So, the dharma, artha, kama of the conventional model, their true goal is actually pleasure. That is kama only, in the sense of the goal. And when we come to moksha, how does the Vedanta define moksha? Brahmavit apnoti param. Brahmavit brahmaeva bhavati. So the knowledge of Brahman, moksha is defined as the knowledge of Brahman, on attaining which one becomes Brahman. Brahmavit apnoti param. So what is Brahman? Brahman is defined in different ways, but for our purpose, the definition of Satchidananda is important, especially the Ananda part. Ananda is bliss. Ananda, I mean, of course, there is no exact translation. I'm just using uh, just a correlation as much as possible. So, Ananda, what is Ananda? Adi Shankaracharya, in his commentary Bhashya on Taittiriya Upanishad, states that Ananda can be understood in two forms, two ways. Whether it arises from the contact of the subject and the object, as in the case with worldly happiness. Just remember the definition of Kama in the Kama Sutra. It is the same definition. Or whether it is natural. And by the Ananda which is natural, Shankaracharya means that Ananda which is Brahman. He explains the worldly bliss, the worldly Ananda, worldly pleasure as a particle of Ananda or bliss that is Brahman, which becomes transmuted into impermanent worldly bliss, consequent on the knowledge becoming covering up by ignorance. So basically, he's saying there is something called as absolute state of bliss, which is Brahman. And a particle of it, as a manifestation of it by covering up ignorance, is what is we experience as pleasure or happiness or sukha in this world. So by this, we can say that Ananda as described in the Upanishad is Kama itself. Therefore, Kama is Brahman. And moksha, which is understood as attaining Brahman or existing as Brahman, can be called as a supreme state of Kama. Because Ananda is pleasure, and we already say Kama is pleasure. So this Kama, we can just replace the term Ananda by the term Kama in the Adi Shankaracharya's commentary on Ananda. So there are two types of Kama, the absolute state of Kama, the supreme state of Kama, which is non-different from Brahman, and the Anga of that, a subsidiary of it, is the worldly Kama or the worldly pleasure, Ananda. So therefore, Kama in its aspect of pleasure, Pratiti, is Parama Purushartha also. Because ultimately, when you are attaining Brahman, it means you are attaining Kama in its supreme state. Now, interestingly, now we saw a definition of a deeper understanding Kama by staying within the framework of conventional Purushartha model and accepting the definitions of Artha, Dharma, Kama, Moksha within the conventional model. But Madhusudana Saraswati, in his Bhagavad Bhakti Rasayana, he beautifully establishes, his goal is to establish Bhakti as the Parama Purushartha. Towards that end, he says that though the four Purusharthas, he says that though we conventionally think that four Purusharthas are the Purusharthas and the goals of life, in reality, they are not the goals in themselves. They are only figuratively called so because they lead to the one true goal of life, which is happiness or pleasure. That is what he says. So while the pursuit of Trivarga leads to happiness which is temporary, anitya, and also mixed with sorrow, it is mixed with dukkha. But the pursuit of moksha leads one to permanent happiness marked by the complete absence of sorrow. And he calls this is the highest goal of life, the state of happiness unmixed with sorrow. He calls this state as dukkha asambhinna sukha, happiness unmixed with sorrow. So you see that what Adi Shankaracharya calls as Ananda in its natural state and what Madhusudan Saraswati calls as Dukkha Asambhinna Sukha, it is supreme state of Kama only in its meaning of pleasure. And here, in the supreme state of Kama, the pleasure is characterized by the complete absence of pain and sorrow. So this absolute Kama is that the Parama Purushartha or the highest goal of life. Whether we perceive Kama as being implicit within the four Purusharthas in the dual form of cause and end goals, as desire and pleasure, or we understand this as independently on its own standing as the absolute state of bliss, we can easily conclude that Kama alone is a true Purushartha. As Madhusudana says, the rest of the Purusharthas are by namesake figuratively called so. In the conventional model, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, they're figuratively called so because they lead to this absolute state of Kama. So in this way, you can see that Kama or the
Nitinji,
desire as in its aspect of desire is primary Purushartha. Kama in its aspect. Oh, yeah, it is just my last slide. Just
yeah, sure. About 5 minutes, and then we can open it up.
Yeah, and Kama in its aspect of pleasure is the Parama Purushartha, is the goal of all the four Purusharthas. And independently, we can say that Kama is the true Purushartha. The rest are merely figuratively so because they lead to them. They're the means to this. And now, however, the discussion is not complete unless we touch Kama as the erotic desire, because Kama has been specially associated with this sense in the, especially in the Kama Shastra tradition, and in a Rudartha, in a day-to-day meaning as well. But in the Indic Hindu worldview, even this erotic desire is not merely a physical craving. It has multiple dimensions, which are which range from the most physical aspect to the most subtle aspect. And Hindu texts advise individuals to understand and enjoy Kama at each level and then transcend them. It is not Victorian in mentality saying that touch me not to Kama. So Kama in the Hindu perspective starts at a physical level as a desire for sexual union. And this then is raised to a level of Purushartha and then into a level of Dharma. This happens in the Dharma Shastras, wherein having sexual union with your legally, dharmically married wife is a dharma, is a duty. It is not simply about desire, no longer just about desire, it's also about duty. And then in the context of theater and natya, it raises this erotic desire into the level of rasa, Shringara rasa, aesthetic experience. And then it further raises it to the level of yajna. For example, Brihadaranyaka Upanishad speaks about how the very act of uh, sexual intercourse and the act of giving birth is a yajna. And in Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, the Bhagwan Shiva gives 112 meditations. Out of it, I think 3 or 4 meditations are sexual meditations. So in this text, the kama is again rise to the level of a meditation, level of yoga and dhyana. And finally, as a means to samadhi. And it is in the bhakti tradition that this erotic desire it becomes the ultimate means to attain moksha. What is called as Shringara Bhakti or Madhurya Bhakti, where the bhakti of the gopis to Krishna, for example, it is this form of bhakti. And it is this form of bhakti is also at the heart of the Stri Dharma, which the Pativrata Dharma, the kind that Savitri, etc. practice. And at each level, there is a reorientation of the erotic love in terms of its object of desire as well as its subtlety. What was merely physical at first is transformed into a duty and engaged in the dharmic act of bringing new life. Later, the same is again transformed into aesthetic pleasure and finally into devotion and spiritual emancipation. In this process, there is also as the object of love transforms from merely physical being into divine Bhagavan himself. Kama itself also transforms from being merely fulfillment of lust into love and then into aesthetic taste and finally into devotion. So in the Hindu scheme of things, eroticism at a physical level is not transcended by repression. It is not transcended by touch me not behavior, but by transformation. So I just want to conclude with this that uh, there is a great need to move beyond the Victorian prejudices and narratives of sexual deviancy. So today we have both extremes. On one hand, we have Victorian prejudice and another taboo, etc. On another hand, we have sexual deviancy imported from the West. And instead, we need to understand karma in a holistic, larger perspective within the context of Purusha. I end here. I hope you enjoyed this brief presentation.
Thank you so much, Nitinji. That's a grand tour of desire, right? From the dimension of Purushartha worldview and a provocative sort of suggestion of Kama as the primary Purushartha, which I think we'll have an interesting conversation on. But I want to pick up on the last part that you covered, and then probably go backwards, towards the aspect of Mumuksha itself, because I think this is supremely relevant. This ability to talk about desire and handle desire, because we live through a time now where the phones on in the palms of your hands relentlessly beam all of world's seductions right there, right? And we're seeing it at a civilizational scale, and I'm not just talking about the Indian civilization, I'm talking about global civilization as a whole, struggling with this aspect of an assault on senses and not having a theory of how to deal with your desires, right? And because there is a bombardment and you don't have a means, towards the end you mentioned about how in the Indian thought desire proceeds from the gross to the subtle, and immediately we could also think of a temple structure and how temples lead you from the outer realm to the sanctum sanctorum, and how we go from gross to subtle. So in every aspect of the civilization in Indian thought, you see this dimension of going from the gross to subtle. And I think that is extremely critical in the global sort of technology disruption that we're seeing today. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Did you ever, when you looked at Kama as a Purushartha, and when you looked at dealing with desire, this whole meditation on desire, how does it, in contemporary context, what does it mean to you?
I think you made a very important point. I think at this point of time, the greatest threat or a challenge we have to our civilization on one hand, but to whole humanity on the other hand is technology. That technology, the kind of revolution it has brought and it is bringing, even going as we speak, is so huge and so fast. We simply do not have tools to actually negotiate with it. I think I sometime back had written an article dealing with negotiating with technology, and therein I mentioned example of how there are today apps which there is an app I came across, I heard somewhere that which caters to those who want to commit adultery, who are not happy in their marriages and who want to have a relationship outside of marriage. The whole app is designed for them. Just imagine the kind of ethical issues, ethical problems, and arising from the ethical problems, the social chaos, the social disturbance, the family disturbance, it is causing. But nobody is actually thinking on these lines at all. We are grappling with the problem, but we do not have a way to tackle it. And what we are doing, because we have sidelined, we have forgotten, we are ignorant about our own knowledge traditions, the knowledge tools that our traditions provide. Uh, what we are doing, we are copy pasting everything from the West. We are imitating the problem, and we are also imitating the supposed solution from the West. Both of them does not work. So we are in a very deep shit, I should say, right? But in the larger level, this is a very important thing. What do we do with the technological changes that is happening? And this need, for example, in the case of karma itself, as you rightly said, um, come let us take the example of sexual education. What is happening in the name of sexual education? They the teacher feels awkward, the student feels awkward, and they at best teach you some form of biology. And if the school is quite liberal and forward looking, they will teach them how to use condoms, how to use this, that, that's all. What about the education of sexual responsibility? Forget sexual restraint, forget about brahmacharya. What about responsibility? Even that is not there, right? But we are at a age, let us say we will remove this sexual education from the curriculum, as there are lots of demands for it. Even then, we have very easy access for porn. We have easy access for, see, when children grow up, they ask questions, they have this curiosity. You simply cannot deny, simply cannot cancel this curiosity. You just close your eyes and think that our children are children. That makes no difference to their growth. On the one hand, and there are related issues like this. Today we have laws, there are recommendation that the age of marriage should be increased even more. On the other hand, on the society level, we have young children as young as 14 or 15 losing their virginity. These are real problems. What is the solution for these sort of problems? As I see it, I think there is a great need to train, to educate our children in the through the model of Purusharthas to tackle life, to approach life. If a child should be trained from the very young age to think that if he is in a situation in a life, whatever may be that situation, he need to be equipped to think in terms of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. Whether what I want comes under dharma, whether what I want comes under artha, kama, or moksha. And if it is coming under artha and kama, whether it is having any undesirable consequences or not, and whether it is really worthy or not. Whether it's kind of the SWOT analysis, right? The positives and negatives, but through the framework of Purusha. And we need to put into their minds that karma, on one hand, it is not a taboo. On the other hand, the deviance is also not desirable. The recklessness is not desirable. Responsibility and restrainment is the key. But this has to be taught at the right age. Now what is happening? On one hand, there is a lot of sexual freedom, whether parents like it or not. You can't monitor the child 24/7, right? So they are put out on the world without any kind of education that can strengthen their willpower, strengthen their faculty of discrimination to take decisions. At the same time, they are also expected, do whatever you want before marriage with whomever you want, I don't care, but you marry only the person that parents want them to marry. You see what is happening? This is a huge problem. This is funny, but it is happening, right? So these are the issues we need to think about as a society as a whole. I, for one, think that, for example, is a controversial opinion. Most people won't agree. I think this arbitrary setting up of age of marriage at 18 is problematic. I think it has to be lower, a bit, if not more. The second is education. That is what is most important. In a traditional society, we had a different format. We had a different setup, wherein, for example, in the Gurukulas, the boys were trained in Indriya Nigra, and they were trained very strongly. And women, the girls, they were taught at home by the fathers. But more importantly, when their sexual desires, when the age came for the sexual desire to form, they were married, so that there was no need for them to actually learn the Indian Nigra. All they had to do is to dedicate it and enjoy it with their husband. So, but that setup is no longer there. Whether it was good or bad, it's a different discussion. I don't want to go into it. But we had such a setup because our ancestors had thought about these problems, and they had created a framework, created a social setup wherein many of the issues that we are facing in modern society were simply non-existent.
Yeah.
Be it the question of unemployment, the unemployment was not there. Every jati had a right for a particular job. Their job was secure. There was no unemployment. Similarly, on these issues, the question of you know the premarital pregnancy, these were very rare events then, but today it is not so. So we have premarital pregnancy and then abortion, then there's legal abortion, there is illegal abortion, and abortion itself as an ethical act is deeply disturbing, deeply problematic, and everybody only wants a convenient answer. They don't want to hear the ethical answer, right? So therein, so I think a study of the Shastras, a study of our frameworks, it equips us, it strengthens our faculty, it provides us with the tools necessary to take a better decision in life. Ultimately, that is a utility as an individual. You and me, if we are able to take better decisions, then that is very useful in our life.
It's a compass. Right? It's a compass to also navigate through the complexity that modernity sort of pits you against, right? Uh,
That is a very important point, the compass aspect, because now the life is so complicated. We have so many different principles conflicting. I think, we are always in a condition of apadharma, and we are
mm,
always in a condition of dharma sankata.
mm,
So even what the Shastra say, we cannot implement two.
yeah.
We have to contextualize it at an individual level based on our own situations. And if we are not equipped to take the decision, then we will be taking decision out of our own instinct, out of our own whatever
Emotions.
kama and artha drives us to do, we'll do it, and later we regret.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like those there are some people who go from one relationship to another relationship to another yet another and never learn that there is something problem with them in their choice of the partners, and they always end up getting hurt. It is like that because we are not better equipped to take a better decision. We are taking whatever decisions we can, and we are suffering the consequences.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And I'm hoping that for our learners, the compelling sort of link between a knowledge system and a shastra and a traditional perspective, and actually, come to think of it, it's a compendium of human experience, and it will be quite arrogant to imagine that we are the first generation to have these problems, right? And so when you have a 5,000, 7,000, whatever number of years of civilization, of continued human experience, it just makes sense to actually learn from it, right? Even from that perspective, like you mentioned, these are not problems that were unheard of, and that's why you had certain design, and you need to figure out what were the principles of that design and apply that in a context. Thank you for that. I wanted to just also get into the dimension of how India as a civilization or our civilization is looked at. Typically, there is this narrative about Indians being otherworldly and being mystical, right? And that is on the other side, one side, and then on the other side you have the exoticization, right? Kama as a pure sort of fantasy and sexual fantasies and orgies, and you impose a European lens. And this a nuanced study of Shastra or a real study of Shastra is able to harmonize and give you a real perspective. I just wanted to get your take on it. because you must have also studied how other scholars, particularly Indologists, have looked at Kama Sutra, and what did that spark? How should we use this as a means to understand civilization?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting. See, there is there are two aspects. One, our society itself has gone tremendous change in the last 1,000+ years because of the result of uh, Islamic invasions followed by the British colonization. And in, during this time, the Hindu institutions have had, some of them have had deteriorated, so to speak. So when the British, so much of these views are from the British experience of India, and their incapacity to actually understand India, so to speak, right? So on one hand, they saw uh, those uh, those who became familiar with the pundits in various places and asked them to translate different texts. They saw a tremendous stress upon moksha, for example, and then they saw the Brahmana communities following a lot of austerities and uh, with the intention to in the ultimate pursuit of moksha. This they mistook as being otherworldly. Second, they also saw the institutions like Devadasi system, which is a which is actually and which they interpreted as prostitution and decadency, right? It is their perception, it is not our perception. Unfortunately, what we have done is we have taken over their perception as our perception today. Today, the institutions like Devadasi, the practices like Sati, all of them are bad mouths. All of them are have branded with these were the practices which had to be reformed. Our society was decadent. So this is how the narrative. This is the British narrative, colonial narrative we have taken on us. But what was Devadasi system? It was the women who worshipped the deity through their arts. It was at once a preservation of the Vidya, going deep into that Vidya, and also a dedication of that Vidya to the worship of the deity with that Vidya. We had a separate Ganika system which were into which can be called as a proper prostitution. But even there, the Ganikas of the higher order, they enjoyed so much political influence that is simply unimaginable in today's what when we use the term prostitution today, right? So we need to understand our own civilization, on its own basis. Instead of approaching them with skepticism, we need to approach them with uh, open-minded, open-mindedness. And of course, every institution undergoes some kind of degeneration, and it has happened. That's a different issue. So this is the problem. That narrative that we are otherworldly on one hand, and on the other hand we are decadent. This is a colonial narrative which is today even going on. The sap sapera wala desh. It's still there. The racism in the West is still there. Coming to the Indologists, I think there was a recent book. I think was it by Donicher, somebody else, saying that how dharma and kama is a rebellion. Kama Sutra is a rebellion against dharma. I think Dr. Bharat Gupji has given a lot of lectures rebuting that book, the thesis of the book. So this is simply idiotic because the Kama Sutra opens with a prayer. Dharmartha kamebhyo namaha. The prayer is for the dharma, artha, and kama, and Vatsayana locates the kama within the Trivarga system. Anyway, so the problem today, what we have had is over the last 200 years, on one hand, we have imbibed the Victorian morality. So what goes in the name of culture today, Hindu culture, is Victorian, Victorian understanding of it. But at the same time, today we are also seeing that so-called rebellion against this Victorian morality is a sexual deviancy and recklessness imported from the West again. So there is a huge lacuna. There is a great people simply do not have this vision of karma as a purushartha, and its true understanding of what does it mean to say that karma as a purushartha. So this Purushartha, missing of this Purushartha drishti, sidelining of the Varnashrama drishti, so these are all fundamental frameworks which upheld our society, either directly or indirectly. The Shastras at the core of Hindu civilization because they provide the very basis, the knowledge basis for our civilization. That is why we are not dead as yet. But what the job the Islamic invaders and the British colonialists did not complete, I am afraid that our present society or present we ourselves are doing it right now. Because we have completely sidelined the Dharma Shastras, we are completely sidelined Kama Shastra. Uh, there are activists on the Hindu side who say that Kama Sutra was written by the British. It is a dabba on the Hindu civilization. It is interpolated. It was manufactured by British. They say the same thing about the Smritis and Dharma Shastra also. Whatever they don't like, they call it as interpolation. Whatever they don't like, they call. This is hurting in a long term. There may be short term benefits. I don't know, but the long term it is hurting because by sidelining our Shastra, by throwing it into a dustbin, as calling them outdated, no longer needed, we are simply throwing a huge uh, well or a huge ocean of knowledge from which we can draw frameworks to negotiate with today's issues. People ask me, I'm bringing the Dharma Shastra related here because it equally applies to Kama Shastra tradition. People ask me that can our Smritis deal with the ethical issues arising out of cloning, for example. I say they can. I am not saying the text mention about cloning. I am saying that they provide the frameworks which help us they provide first principles which makes us capable of dealing with these issues. We do not have, we have forgotten the very functioning of Shastra. I keep saying this nowadays again and again. The role of Shastra is a pramana. Its role is as a pramana. It reveals us knowledge which cannot be known from other sources. What we do with this knowledge is our responsibility. But throwing this knowledge into dustbin and under whatever be that excuse, that is foolishness.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll pick up a few questions that have come up on chat. Gajendra, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or would you prefer if I relate? I'm not sure if Gajendra is able to speak, but his first question was on the relationship between karma and kama, if there is any, between vichara and desire, between thought and desire.
Is it between karma and kama, or is it between?
The question was karma and kama. If there is a link, or how do we associate?
The desire impels actions that you desire. For example, in the Vedic statement which is used in the Mimamsa is Swarga Kamo Yajeta. Those who have desire for Swarga perform this yajna, sacred. So that is the relationship between desire and action. The desire impels action.
Second question on the sort of gradation of desire that you mentioned, right? From the gross to the subtle. The question was that if Ananda is supreme form of desire, if that is the highest point of transcendence, and then we are saying that there is an inferior form of desire. If desire or kama has this gradation, how can it become the Parama Purushartha?
Interesting question. Yeah. See, we are all limited by the limitations of the language. It is not that there are two forms of desire per se. There is, and when I say that kama is Parama Purushartha, I am speaking of kama in the sense of pleasure, not desire. In the sense of Ananda is the pleasure, Ananda is the bliss, Sukha unmixed with Dukkha, right? That is what Ananda is. And this is an absolute state, that is, this is Brahman. And this same Brahman or this Ananda, it manifests at a worldly level as this limited Ananda. There is only one Ananda, that is absolute Ananda, or one Kama, the absolute state of Kama. You see, there are no two things. The same thing, when it manifests into our level, it becomes limited. So it is not that one, it is when we speak about this is inferior and that is superior, it is only from our standpoint of view. In our limited standpoint of view, we see that the worldly pleasure is temporary. Now I passed an exam, I got 100 marks, I am happy. But that happiness do not stay for long, it goes away. But if you attain moksha, then there is nothing else remaining. That moksha, which is of the form of ananda or happiness, that same happiness only you are actually experiencing in your worldly life when you pass an exam. See, there is a there is a the Bhoja Raja, for example, and others also. They explain this in a very uh, very detailed way how this happens, like what this experience of ananda in the worldly life means, that it is merely when the impediments are removed, we get the, because of the punya we experience that ananda, something like that is there, but that is beside the point for this discussion. I would like to
Question.
take that question about sati, somebody is asking, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to take that next, and then we go back to a couple of
Yes, yes. I just want to make a quick point. I have written a detailed essay on sati. It is available in Indic today. Please read it. Sati, revisiting sati. That's the title of the. I'm not saying sati is something we need to practice today, and I'm not saying that there were not instances wherein sati was misused in the last during the colonial times. And Meenakshi Jain has actually proved beyond doubt that the exaggerations in numbers and all, they were exaggerations, they were not reality. But I will urge you this: the Hindu Dharma Shastric perception or the conception of sati is not negative. It is not oppressive towards women. It is not degrading towards women. It is not exploitative of women. They specifically say that sati is a voluntary practice. Sati is a practice that though the woman has, it's her decision, but all the family members and the society has to prevent her from doing it as much as possible by convincing her. The very ritual of sati has this part wherein the family members try to prevent her, tell her not to do it. And it is a voluntary practice. It was a practice that the women took upon out of extreme love and courage for their husband. It's a part of the Sri Dharma. It is not for everybody. Never, most people never practiced it. Throughout history, there is no evidence that a lot of people practiced it. There are only minor examples from here and there. A friend of mine did a statistical analysis for the last 2000 years. It is not even 0.1%. So, but it was always, but no, nevertheless, it was celebrated as something unique, something supreme sacrifice, something example of supreme love. You have that satigallu, the stones commemorating the sati. Today, we have a negative view of such women because of the colonial intervention. Before the colonial intervention, though rarely women practiced it, committed sati, those who committed sati were deeply respected in the society. They were not considered as idiotic women. They were not considered as exploited women. There may have been cases of exploitation. I am not denying that. But by and large, in the Dharma Shastra, in the Shastri conception of sati, it was not an exploitative practice. It was a practice which was a voluntary practice by very nature. By very definition, it was voluntary. Please read my essay. It provides evidence from the primary sources. I just want to say that.
A couple of questions that are, I think, linked on the idea of hedonism, right? And we've sort of touched upon that in the first question. But how does, how do we not get into the zone of the charvakas and the hedonists when you start thinking about karma? And where does that balance lie? What does your research tell us?
See, I think the reason this hedonistic attitude or the charvaka attitude comes in is because you see karma first of all in a very limited sense as pursuit of mundane pleasure, especially pursuit of sexual pleasure and such things, mundane things, without understanding the deeper meaning of what karma actually is. people say today that you only live once, YOLO. That is a meme today. And this meme, has done great damage. In fact, perhaps it's a symptom of damage which is already done, I would say. Because this is the problem. This is at the root of hedonism. You think that this is the only life you have, then logically it follows. This is the Charvaka argument, right? There is no other reality. There is no other world. You only live once. The body dies, and everything over. Push. So then you think that I have to do everything to pleasure myself in a very gross sense. So what is the solution to this? The solution to this is two things. From the very young age, the young minds have to be, Shraddha have to be generated in them towards Dharma and towards Ishvara. If you align yourself towards Ishvara, you connect with Ishvara, you connect with the deities, Devatas, and have the conviction that they are true, they are real, and you are into sadhana some way or the other. And then align yourself with the Dharma, with the Purushartha framework. When I speak about Dharma and have in mind the Purushartha framework, then you will realize that desires of many nature. Desire to experience a deity is also a desire. Desire to live ethical life is also a desire. It is not merely a mundane pleasure which is desire. So we need to go beyond that, beyond the understanding of desire in a very limited sense. And I see that education is perhaps the only solution for all problems. All fundamental problems, the education is the solution. Catch them young, as they say.
No, I think the force multiplier is always education and bringing back Indic knowledge systems and applying that in a contemporary context, like how we're attempting to do it now. There's a question from a fellow Vedantin. Srihari, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, Raghavji. Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Namaste.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Namaste, Nitinji. It was a great opportunity and a blessing for me to listen to your talk and your perspective on karma. So my question was, my understanding of the state of Brahman is a state of desirelessness. So when that is given, and you say that the state of Paramanandam is also kama, but you have also given that it's a different degradation. I mean, a gradation in terms of gross and the subtle level. But I am not able to synthesize both in terms of calling the state of Paramanandam as kama. I'm not able to synthesize that. So I just wanted to get your insight on that.
Excellent question. I'm really glad you asked. There are two things here. One is when you're pursuing moksha, one of the criteria, as I explained, is vairagya, right? Which is dispassion. But as I playfully put it, even vairagya has raga in it. But what is this raga? It is raga is attachment to either to Ishvara or the pursuit of moksha, the burning desire for moksha. So when we speak of a vairagya, vairagya is the dispassion towards worldly pursuit, not the dispassion towards pursuit of Brahman, realization of Brahman, right? So that is one thing. That is why the first verse of Isha Upanishad says, Isha vasam idam sarvam yatkincha jagatyam jagan tena tyaktena bunjita. Tena tyaktena, you renounce the attachment to the world. Bunjita, enjoy the self. Established in the self. You enjoy this bliss of self, right? So when I say that moksha is also kama, again I am clarifying it so that to remove confusion. I am not saying that moksha is desire. Kama has a twofold definition of desire as well as pleasure. Kama in its sense of means is desire, but in its sense of accomplishment, awareness, the end goal is pleasure. And in this sense of pleasure, Brahman is the supreme pleasure. It is a supreme ananda, right? Is Satchidananda Brahma, right? So it is in that sense that the ultimate goal, moksha, is ananda. Moksha is kama. In the sense of kama in the absolute state, wherein by that I mean in the state of pleasure. not as desire, not as hankering to something. Brahman hankers for nothing, right? So I hope this clarifies the confusion that you had.
Thank you, Nitin ji. We'll have to meditate on it and contemplate more about that.
Please read my paper
Yeah,
again after the session, and it will be easy for to contemplate upon.
definitely, we'll do that. Thank you so much.
No, it's also sort of a small representation of the creative culture of our tradition, right? Where these multiple meanings and contemporization is always possible, while staying within the within the way of studying Shastra, within the Shraddha and Tarka mode. You are able to think about a new creative interpretation, and that sparks a new theory itself. Right? And Srihari, that's also the spirit in which I think we should look at any provocation coming from within the study and giving us a new possibility. Ruchi, you want to go ahead?
Namaste, Nitinji. While working in menstrual health and hygiene, it was your book which shook me ki how grand our culture is and how we see everything. The perspective is so wide, the menstruation across cultures. So my question is, as you said, with the developing tech, we have this social and emotional learning tools which are for the disposal of adolescents. But the thing is, they create so much of distrust in them, and that curiosity somewhere takes them down the path where they learn everything on their own, basically, without being susceptible from an adult. That viewpoint. So it's like in joint families, earlier days we have everyone, mama, nana, kaka. But now kids see everyone as someone who will who will make them a victim or who will sexually exploit them. So basically, is there a framework where we can let them be of who they are, their swabhava, and we can create a system of checks and balances of how they can be stopped by dharma, moksha, or artha? Because karma will not die. If you ask me, Ruchi, don't do this, I might do that more often. So, is there a tool or a model or a framework where we can read and make it up in a better version of for to be implemented across cultures and for the wider range of society?
I think that's a very difficult question, I would say. But yes, there is definitely possible to evolve such models. It is not that it is not there per se. I mean, for example, uh, I think the ideal time to train children and make them anchor in our civilizational values is before they become adolescent. You know, so what is the means to teach them at that age? It is through the stories from Ramayana, through the stories from Mahabharata. See, why were these Itihasa Puranas were written? They were written to give us one of the purposes. Of course, they had many purposes. Is through is to teach these Purushartha, Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, especially Dharma, through human models, through good examples and bad examples. Examples of people like Rama, as well as examples like people of Rama, like Ravana. But today, what is happening? We have reversed these ideals. Today, Ravana is a cherished hero, and Rama is the villain, right? So this is the fundamental problem. So we need to, and this Nana Kaka that you mentioned, that that family provided a means to introduce children to these stories, especially the grandmothers and all. But that is missing today. Uh, the second point is whatever we do, ultimately the fact is the children have their own mind, and they will go through their own trajectory, and we cannot simply stop it. It is inevitable that they will discover things, they will learn things on their own. For example, my journey started from one single book changed me from made me an atheist, and from there my philosophical journey started. So the point is, uh, we need to give them frameworks like this Purushartha framework, and the frameworks of Bhagavad Gita, for example, like Swadharma, Paradharma, and the importance of the framework of Varnashrama Dharma. These are the frameworks that we need to teach them. You see, the Bhagavad Gita is a text that can be taught to children at a very young age. They may not know the meaning at that time, but once they engage with the text, once they begin to like these texts, like the stories in the text, then as they grow up, they will read more on their own. You know, you have to create the taste in them. Before the adolescent age, we create the taste in them for dharma, create the taste in them for festivals. See, the parents have to first. So today the parents don't know dharma, so you can't expect much from the children. So the parents have to first learn dharma, practice it, create an environment in the home. See, the school environment is hopeless, and I don't think it is going to change in any time in our lifetime. So we have to do it at our own place. So create an environment of introspection. I have faced this myself when I was young. When I used to ask question, nobody gave me proper answers. The lack of answering is one of the reasons why teenagers rebel. So that has to change. The parents has to educate themselves so that they can educate their children. And the responsibility of teaching dharma, responsibility of teaching this purushartha and making them rooted, it is the parents' responsibility. It is not a responsibility of a teacher in the school to begin with, because our school is not a gurukulam. Even when gurukulam system was there, the father and mother were the first guru. Our ancestors did not give away that responsibility to somebody else. So as I see it, and if you are asking in a more academic sense that whether can we design some programs for this,
Yes.
I feel definitely it is possible. I think in Indic Academy we have this iGen Plus, wherein they are doing a lot of events for the youngsters, that models such programs can be done wherein we introduce stories from Mahabharata. See, I remember when I was in school, we had so-called moral education, and it is pakka bekar. Kuch bhi, I mean, it was completely useless. Instead of that moral education, at least at home or through any institution, why not give them moral education through the education into our text? We have so many texts. It does not even have to be Mahabharata and Ramayana at all. It can be many of the Sanskrit texts, many of the Indian language texts. But what is needed is a discussion around the whatever stories are included. Without that, that stories is meaningless. We will read the story, we will forget the story. The need is to for a discussion, especially around the Dharma Sankata issues. If you are putting up a, for example, um, you put a story about Yudhishthira or about Rama, or you put a story of Mrichakatikam, you know, if that story is being put, there is lot of issues that can be discussed. There are a lot of points of discussion, and such discussions opens up the mind of these adolescents to a different way to look at life. You know, because these stories ultimately they are archetypes. They reflect our reality. They encode our reality in a very subtle matter. The same story can give 10 different messages to 10 different people in a different life situation. So that is and that is the fundamental beauty of this stories. That so I think this is how we have to approach the youngsters through stories, through through certain teachings of our shastras, a bit here, a bit there, a bit everywhere kind of teachings, because you know not all of them take up shastra. They don't have even interest to take up shastras in that detail, right? So we have to teach them a bit here, a bit there, a bit from everywhere. You include bit from Manusmriti, you include bit from Mahabharata, you include bit from Kama Sutra. Why not? Yeah, definitely. See, adolescents, if a 14, 15-year-old kid can lose virginity in this day, they can definitely study a bit from Kama Sutra about importance of Kama as a restraint, as a responsibility. Sure, we have to teach them those values in a correct manner. That is needed.
Jill, do you have another question or you're good? And then I'll go to Kamal. Ruchi, was there another question about karma in different contexts and different?
No,
Is that address?
sir, sir, I have already clear. But sir, with in this age of instant gratification, to develop that sort of a patience in kids is so tough. And when we say stories, they are subjective across the domains. Like we see the word जैसी दृष्टि वैसी सृष्टि, if I say. So whatever we communicate to the kids, they might be able to see it in terms of how they think that thing is. So with social media, everything is on their tips. So with the tech interventions is, if I ask you that one pointer which you can give as a pill, ओवरऑल कि हाँ ये ले लो, ये सॉल्यूशन अभी के लिए है, एंड देन यू कैन बिल्ड आउट in a subtle way over a period of time.
See, it is true that social media and we sub hey technology, but there are a lot of people using it for well-being as well, right? So I think there is an app called Gurukulam or something. I downloaded it a few days ago. It is completely brilliant. It has stories from Ramayana, stories from different. It's completely designed for kids. It has even it is available in English. It is available in Sanskrit. Small audio clips teaching the Gita. Just imagine such a beautiful app. So if our children are addicted to mobile, why not use this app to teach them, right? And you're right. This is time for instant gratification. In my daughter, 1 year old now, because I work in mobile, she wants to mobile. She wants to take my mobile. She wants me to show her the music or something in the mobile. No matter how, there is a limit I can prevent her, but beyond that, it is not possible because we are living in such a society wherein it's the technology you grow in that. When I was kid, there was no mobile, right? But in my father's time, there was no telephone also. So you cannot we cannot simply say that technology will go away. But yes, the same one, Gurukulam by Anadi Foundation. I think it is the same one. Uh, but we have to find ways. It is difficult. I don't think I have discovered everything. I think each of us has to try our own different, trial and error methods. But basically, the duty is upon the parents to judge, to evaluate their kids and contextualize the teachings in a way, that it's like Kung Fu Panda movie. The panda never learnt when his shifu taught him in a normal way, the way he taught everybody, but he taught him using the food as a instrument. The panda learned easily, right? So each of the kids are like pandas, and in that movie, that we have to tailor made the teachings to them by judging their character. Our gurus used to do that in previously in a Gurukulam mode. Now we have to do it ourselves.
Kamal, you want to go ahead next?
Yes, thank you, Raghavji. Namaste, Nitinji. Thank you for your presentation. Really grateful for the opportunity to listen. My question, Nitinji, is like from a very daily life perspective. And when we think of dharma and artha, there is also an aspect of sacrifice which comes to mind from our day-to-day experiences. So how do we think about that, and how, because that is like the opposite of desire in a way. Like sacrifice is, I mean, generally we think of it as a opposite. So how do we reconcile this? And like, especially because the point about dharma and artha being different forms or higher forms of kama, but how does sacrifice fit into that?
Yeah, I think you are using the sacrifice in a very normal sense of tyaga, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see it in this way, right? See, first of all, what we are, if we are giving up something, for example, this comes under Indriya Nigra. I see an ice cream, and every time I have a desire to eat the ice cream, I am not eating the ice cream. I am trying to restrain myself, my desire. I am trying to ensure that the desires, the Indriyas do not control me, the senses do not control me, but I control, right? So you can reformulate it this way, that I am trying to, I have a desire to control my indriyas. That is why I'm trying to do this. So you can reframe it in a positive way as well, or in a sense, in the way of desire as well. It is not difficult to reframe it, but the point is, it's not needed to reframe everything in the terms of desire. See, this is a perspective that I have provided. That doesn't mean on a day-to-day basis you have to necessarily reframe everything in that way, right? But the why this perspective is important is to ensure that is to have this understanding that life is our. We are not a life-denying civilization. We are life-enriching civilization, and the definition of enrichment changes. At the mundane level, it is the pursuit of pleasure and prosperity. But at a higher level, it's a pursuit of self. It is a pursuit of self-knowledge. It is pursuit of spiritual. It is pursuit of punyam also. Even pursuit of ethics is a higher pursuit. So this knowledge, this understanding, when it comes to us, then we will be able to appreciate that there are deeper things to pursue, more meaningful things to pursue in life, rather than this just eating the ice cream every time. You see it. You can save that money that you're saving from. Instead of eating 10 ice creams in a month or in a week, you eat only one ice cream and you save the other money. You can put it in share market, right? Instead of Kama, you can get money from Artha. Or you can save that money and give Dhanam to somebody. And Dhanam is also Tyaga, right? You are giving something that which belongs to you, to somebody else. You know, the Mimamsakas define Dana. I was reading this, I think, Mimamsa Paribhasha, wherein it defines Dana as giving up the ownership over something and giving the ownership of something to somebody else. And it generates great punyam. So you can say, you can think that I am doing dhanam because it is a dharmic act. And by dharmic act, punya is generated, which will lead me to swarga. You have that motive in a sakama way. Or you can think that I am doing it because it is my duty in a nishkama way. In that case, it will generate chitta shuddhi, purification of mind, which will take you towards moksha. So the beauty of, let me put it out, that I do not think this dharma, artha, kama, moksha, they are merely mental frameworks. See, I have been using this framework terms again and again through this lecture, but I do not think that they are just frameworks. They are knowledge. They are real. It's not just there. We are just mentally conceiving of them. These are the knowledge revealed by our rishis. This is the knowledge that the Shastras reveal us, and Shastra is the pramana, independent pramana. So when the Shastra says that if you do dhanam, you will get punyam, you will get punyam. It is not just a incentive to you to do that action. It is really happens. So when and this moksha, so the beauty is that the dharma is conceived in such a way, posited in such a way, given to us in such a way, that if you pursue artha and kama, I mean speaking from the conventional model, if you pursue artha and kama within the confines of dharma, through dharma, by staying within dharma, then it helps you to not only fulfill your desires, but also help you to take towards moksha slowly. If not in this life, some other life, but it will help you to take there by giving chitta shuddhi. So that is the beauty of dharma. It is the connection between artha and kama on one hand and moksha on the other hand. That is why dharma is most important. And if you have to use the language of today's framework of kama, then pursuing ethics or ethical life is much more superior to pursuing limited pursuit of artha and kama. Why? Because if you're pursuing ethical life, then you are getting punyam, and that punyam is taking you to better place in your next janmam. It is taking you to swargam. It is taking you to chitta shuddhi and ultimately to moksha. So however you see it, pursuit of dharma is correct. That is why in the beginning I said that my enunciation of kama as a parama purushartha or as a primary purushartha, it provides a different, deeper perspective to conventional model. It does not refute the conventional model. It reinforces the conventional model in a sense.
I think that addresses a few other questions also that have come up that Srihari asked and somebody else also mentioned later. Namrata, you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? Question on yoga and the link between yoga and kama.
Yeah, sure, I can go. So my basic concern is So on the one hand, I understand that one of the yamas of Ashtanga yoga is brahmacharya. Whereas on the other side, we are also told how union is yoga, but that's obviously union with a higher self. So I'm just not able to kind of maneuver between these two seemingly contradictory ideas. So if you could just speak something on that, or
Can you just repeat what contradiction are you exactly saying? I didn't get that.
so brahmacharya, as I understand in Ashtanga yoga, is probably something where I restrain from indulging in kama or any form of that.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, like we've discussed right now, it is a purushartha, or it is, trying to achieve a higher form of union is definitely an endeavor and a dimension of human experience.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'm not able to reconcile these two ideas.
Okay. Okay. Good question. Good question. See, we have to see these definitions within the context of the textual tradition that this context that the definition applies. For example, the Ashtanga yoga is not a path for everybody. Not everybody can attain the highest through that path. It is path for those who are adhikari or who are competent for that. For example, if there is one path to the highest, then everybody would have we would have been a monotheistic religion, right? In a sense, but that is not so. So now the definition of brahmacharyam in Ashtanga yoga, in the sense of complete celibacy, is a valid definition, and it is needed for Ashtanga yoga practice. Fine, but what about definition of brahmacharya in other contexts? For example, take the social context as enunciated in the Smritis. In the student phase of brahmacharya, celibacy, absolute celibacy is needed. Yes. But in the grihastha phase, what the text say, if a grihastha has sexual relationship with his wife only on designated days, that is excluding the days on which he is not supposed to have a sexual union. I mean, in a 30-day cycle of a woman, the 4 days are menstruation are excluded, and then there are certain days which are considered as not good to have sexual union from a otherworldly perspective, from a punya papa perspective. Some 8 or 10 days are removed, and there are certain vratas and other days they're removed. So what remains is in a month, 4 or 5 days or something like that. So if you're doing a sexual relationship with the wife on those days, even then such a grihastha is considered as a brahmachari. You get my point?
Acha, okay, follow.
Yes.
So it may be the understanding is not absolute celibacy, which would, because then
Yes.
understand.
So you get the point, right? So
Right.
brahmacharya is understood in different way, in different contexts, in different traditions, and all of
Right.
them are equally valid. So what is the purpose of marriage? Let us begin with there. Vivaha
Yeah.
has these 3 pillars of rati, dharma, and praja. So the rati, only those who have desire for worldly pleasures, including sexual pleasure, take up this grihastha. They cannot take up directly the Ashtanga yoga. That is simply meaningless, because you suppressing the desire is not helpful. So desire
True.
has to be fulfilled in a directed way, in a ordered way, in a restrained way, such that you develop vairagya slowly. So when you practice this karma anushtana and you have this chitta shuddhi, and by chitta shuddhi, your all this kama, krodha, etc. are kind of tamed, then you can take up Ashtanga yoga in a proper sense, the yama, niyama, etc. And then there is other path of bhakti. The beauty, see the beauty of bhakti. In the bhakti tradition, especially the bhakti of the form of Shringara bhakti or the Madhurya bhakti, as I gave the example of Gopi towards Krishna, there at the physical level, you can say they may or may not be practicing brahmacharya. For example, gopis were all married persons, right? But at the same time, Akka Mahadevi left her marriage and she took up the path of austerity and celibacy. But even her bhakti to Shiva or the gopis bhakti to Krishna, it is bhakti of a wife towards a husband. It is a conjugal bhakti. It is a sexual bhakti. It is a erotic bhakti. But when a celibate, when you're practicing celibacy on one hand and practicing bhakti of erotic nature towards the deity, see the beauty here. That eroticism is already changed from physical gross to a subtle level. So at the physical level, you're already brahmacharya, but at a subtle level, you're practicing kama, right? So there is a nuance here, and different traditions, different spiritual sampradayas go. It's like the just as all the rivers ultimately join the ocean, all the sampradayas ultimately join the ultimate in two different ways. And each of them has brahmacharya is there for all of them, but in a different context, it means difference. There are different things. That is the only thing we need to keep in mind.
In the last couple of questions, Dhawan, you want to go ahead next?
Yes, sir. Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Namaskara, Nitinji. My question was, if worldly pleasure is one form of Satchidananda, then what is the motivation for the Atman to make a journey towards Brahman?
See, Atman is Brahman. See, it is because of avidya that we think that our jiva is distinct from. See, I am a Advaitin, so I will be speaking from Advaita perspective, and you may disagree. I don't mind. But as far as Upanishadic perspective and the way Advaitic perspective is concerned, Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. Brahmo Satyam Jagat Mindya, Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha. So it is because of avidya we think that we are limited. But even in this limited sense, we have a hankering. We have a hankering to attain, to have sukha and dukkha, right? Why this hankering is there? Because our real nature is sukha, sukha without dukkha. That is why this we are have a hankering even in this limited sense for that sukha. Because we want to actually go back home. We want to return home, so to speak. That is why the jiva takes up all the difficulty. There is a beautiful conversations in Upanishad. It says, you do not love your wife for her sake, but you love her for your sake. You do not love the friends for their sake, you love it for your sake. So actually, you are actually loving yourself. The self is the only reality. You're sleeping, you're dreaming, you're waking up. That is one reality which is self-evident. It does not require any other proof to prove it. The Upanishads are actually not proving the existence of self. They are merely pointing that this self that you know is Brahman. They are only giving this knowledge of identity. They are not proving you that self exists. You already know. When I say I am Nitin, there is already I in that. Right?
Yes.
So that is why. The sukha we experience now is limited. So we want permanent sukha, right? Nobody wants permanent dukkha. I have not come across any person who say, I want permanent sorrow in life. No, you all want permanent sukha. And that is why this pursuit of permanent sukha leads us back to Brahman. Leads us back to understand our own real nature.
And that is the mumukshvatva that you also allude to in your article. Last question, and we'll end with Bhima's wisdom. And you used Bhima as an anchor to make that provocative sort of assertion. So question on Bhima's wisdom, his nature, and what should we understand? How should we understand Bhima's position?
Interestingly, I think because of the effect of the Mahabharata serial of the 1980s, we all think Bhima as a macho man with little brain. And but if you read the Mahabharata, it is not so. He was macho, yes, but he was also macho in his brain. he was very much, he had a great clarity on dharma, his great clarity on purusharthas, and my friend Hari, um, he's written a series of articles on Bhima, and basically based on Dvaita philosophy, but also based on Mahabharata itself, how Bhima was he was a manifestation of Vayu, right? He was just as he was kind of a brother to Hanuman, right? So, and there are multiple instances throughout Mahabharata wherein Bhima's wisdom comes forth. Even in the instance that I have quoted, what is interesting is Vidura puts a point of view, Arjuna puts a point of view, Nakula Sahadeva put a point of view, Bhima also puts a point of view. And finally, Yudhishthira puts a point of view saying moksha is the ultimate Purushartha. But Yudhishthira does not actually refute others' opinion. Why? Because all their opinion are equally valid from their particular standpoint. One of them says, Vidura says dharma is ultimate, most primary. And from Vidura's standpoint, he's correct. And that is the conventional model, the dharma is the primary. From Arjuna, Nakula Sahadeva, Arjuna's especially point of view, Artha is primary because Artha is what facilitates to us to do the dharma. Even I think in Arthashastra, this perspective is there. Because Artha is resources. Without resources, you cannot do dharma, right? In the Mimamsa, for doing a yajna for the Swargakama, you have to have the money to do that yajna. So, from that perspective, it is correct. Similarly, what Bhima is saying is also correct. So all of them are actually correct. They are approaching the issue from a different perspective. And this is the purpose of this conversation in the Vyasa Bharata. Our Maharshi Vyasa is perhaps the most, we owe the entire Sanatana Dharma as we know it today. And in a few days back, I had written a post on this, how much of what goes as Hinduism today is actually traces back to Vyasa Parampara. So this whole conversation, beautiful conversation, he has not actually put in to say that this is great, that is great, or in an absolute sense. But he has put in to provide a perspective wherein different perspectives are useful to different people. For example, for a Raja, for a king, Artha as being more important to him is very important. Because if he thinks Artha, because Artha comes under his purview. But that may be not so for everybody else, right? So the correct way, at least in my individual opinion, to approach this whole thing is not to think that what Bhima says or what Arjuna says is inferior and only what Vidura says is superior or what Yudhishthira says is superior. Instead, perceive it as a wholesome teaching in itself. Each perspective is valid in its own standpoint. And we can reconcile all of them with each other, just as I have reconciled Bhima's view with the conventional model of Purushartha, and I have showed it that they are not contradictory. They are just two ways of looking at it. And if you understand both the ways, then your knowledge is enriched. You are not misled into thinking that because moksha is the ultimate goal, anybody who is into, say, pursuit of sexual pleasure is a depraved person. You will not get into such misunderstood perspective of karma. So this such a wholesome, holistic understanding prevents such distortions. Hope this answers.
We'll end on that note of harmony and harmonization of life in all its forms. I think the whole idea of leadership also, Nitinji, from our side, is this ability to look at the integrality and look at the complexity of the world's problems today and use our frameworks to provide new solutions. So thank you so much for bringing this to light for us. Thank you for provocating. Thank you so much for actually positing a new way to look at this, and that opens up the creative possibility of a new discussion. Right? We have the Purushartha framework, and it is eternally relevant. But the way you have gone into the tradition, gleaned from the tradition, looked at multiple sources from Mahabharata to Bhoja's work, to reconciling with Advaita and Shankaracharya's Bhashya, That is a very, very rich synthesis. And then coming up with a new proposition. And that proposition opening up the possibility of a conversation. I was particularly thrilled reading your paper and just looking at the possibilities. And thank you for agreeing to come talk to us. Very, very, very deeply grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Love the session. Thank you.
Shiv, we will close with a prayer.
Yes, Raghav.
पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.